I'd been working for a few months as a night clerk at a motel tucked into a forgotten stretch of Route 66, the kind of place no one stays for pleasure, only out of exhaustion, necessity, or worse. And that night, around 11:40 p.m., a man with sunken eyes and a restless look entered the lobby with a request that changed the air in the room. Room 12. The request left me paralyzed for a few seconds. Not even the local guests, the few who still knew the story, dared mention that number out loud. Room 12 had been sealed for over 3 decades. The latch rusted, the wallpaper peeling under layers of time and neglect, and yet he wanted that room. Have you ever witnessed something so out of the ordinary that it made your intuition scream, but you didn't know how to react? It was exactly like that. Something inside me told me not to let that man up, but he insisted with disturbing calm. He said he'd traveled miles just for this, that he'd been waiting for this moment for years, that this particular room was important. And the strangest thing, he knew the key no longer existed. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now might surprise you. It wasn't common for someone to know so much about a forgotten room in a rundown motel in rural New Mexico. Even less so for someone to state in no uncertain terms that they didn't need a key, that they just had to approach the door for it to open. And he said this, looking me in the eye, with a firmness that was inhuman. It was as if he were repeating something rehearsed, learned, passed down from generation to generation. I tried to laugh it off, pretend it was just a misunderstanding. I dropped the hint that room 11 was available with a new bed and a working TV, but he didn't smile. He just pointed down the hall with a trembling finger, and I swear on everything that's holy that at that moment the lights in the reception area flickered. Have you ever felt that dry shiver that starts at the nape of your neck and runs down your back as if something were probing you, even without touching? That's how I knew that night would be different from all the others. There are places that hold memories. There are rooms that hold more than dust. Sometimes they hold pieces of stories that should never be relived. And when someone tries to force time to reopen what was locked away, what's inside, it responds. Room 12 wasn't just empty, it was waiting. And as I handed the man an old key to another room, just to get him out of there, I noticed he was already holding something in his hand. An old keychain made of tarnished metal with the number 12 engraved with a fingernail. That night, I broke one of the unwritten rules of motels. Never, under any circumstances, ask what brings a man to a room that time has tried to erase. And when he disappeared down the hall without a sound, I knew something had been released. But that was just the beginning. That night, I broke one of the unwritten rules of motels. Never under any circumstances ask what brings a man to a room that time has tried to erase. And when he disappeared down the hall without a sound, I knew something had been released. But that was just the beginning. By the way, before I move on, I need to open a parenthesis for you who are listening now, because perhaps this kind of story will awaken in you the same feeling I felt that night, that silent restlessness, as if the past were trying to whisper something in your ear. And if you've ever experienced something similar, a strange place, a strong intuition, an inexplicable presence, share it here in the comments. I read everything, I really do. And every story you leave here helps to piece together this great puzzle that is the world that exists behind what we call reality. If this topic resonates with you, if it gives you goosebumps the way it gave me when I experienced it, click the like button. It helps a lot, more than you can imagine. It shows the algorithm that there are people interested in this kind of content, and it gives me the strength to continue bringing you stories that many would rather forget. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's the time. Because honestly, what I'm about to tell you next isn't found in books or news reports. These are stories like this, experienced by me and other ordinary people, that intertwine to reveal a truth few have the courage to face. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who, like you, may be looking for answers that no one else is willing to give. Now take a deep breath, because after that man entered room 12, time inside the motel seemed to behave differently, and what happened in the following hours haunts me to this day. The wind that night seemed denser. It blew through the cracks in the windows as if dragging along old heavy memories that had never found rest. The motel sign, with its erratically flickering lights, cast shadows that danced across the cracked asphalt of Route 66. It was as if time had stopped there, leaving everything suspended. Those who passed through that stretch of road usually didn't stay there by choice. The motel functioned more as a last-minute shelter, a temporary resting place for exhausted truckers, couples looking to hide, or wandering souls who preferred anonymity to safety. But everyone who returned told different stories, and they avoided mentioning room 12. It was a strange place. The main building had 2 floors. The ground floor, where reception and some renovated rooms were located, was where most guests stayed, when there were guests. The second floor, especially the east wing, was almost always avoided, especially after sunset. There was no rule against it, but the staff themselves made a point of leaving that area in disrepair. Burnt-out light bulbs, frayed curtains, dust on the doorknobs. Everything there seemed to scream that this hallway had been intentionally neglected, and at the end of it was room 12. It was a simple number, but it held strange meanings. The older staff said that years ago, a man had stayed in that room for 3 nights in a row, alone. No one saw him leave, but they hadn't heard a sound either. On the 4th day, the maid went in and found the room empty. The bed made, no belongings, nothing, just the television tuned to a dead channel, and something written on the fogged-up mirror: "It's never just a room." After that, the manager decided to lock the door and throw away the key. He hammered the frame himself and had it boarded up from the inside. He said it was just in case, that it was better this way, but no one asked, because everyone there already knew, even if they never said it out loud, that this room was different. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because over the months I worked there, I began to notice patterns. The more experienced truckers, those who'd been on the roads for decades, sometimes stopped just for coffee and a stretch, but none of them ever asked for a room for the night. And whenever someone new took the overnight shift, the veterans spoke in code. If anyone asked for 12, there's no room. Or, if the key goes missing, leave it gone. It was as if everyone was looking after something they didn't fully understand, but knew shouldn't be disturbed. Once I logged into the computer system to try to pull up the guest history for room 12, but the room didn't even appear in the database, as if it had never existed, as if the physical space were there, but administratively empty. And yet, the room was still in the building. It was still there, locked, silent, waiting. One morning, while the phone rang non-stop because of an unconfirmed reservation, a man walked through the glass reception door. He wore a worn leather jacket, and his face was weather-beaten. As I approached, before I could even say, "Good evening," he said, "It's still closed, right?" I asked him what. He didn't answer. He just looked toward the stairs and muttered, "It's been over 20 years, and I still feel like it's in there." That night I couldn't sleep, even after my shift. I kept thinking about what he meant. That, as if it were a living thing. As if the room carried an invisible weight, something that could be felt by anyone who had ever been too close. As I connected these stories and observed the guests' behavior, I began to understand that there was more behind that door than just ancient history. There was something there, as if the room held a kind of memory of its own, a place that refused to be forgotten even when ignored, a place that enticed the right people to return. As if there were a hidden truth waiting to be discovered or relived, and then it all came flooding back that night when the man showed up asking for that very room. The key was gone, and yet he already had it. The door opened, he walked in, and time seemed to stand. Still, since then, I began to notice small changes around me, not just in the motel but in myself as well. as if something had been transferred in that silent exchange, as if the room had somehow chosen me to carry part of what had been trapped inside for so many years. I began to have dreams, brief visions, like flashes of memories that weren't mine, people screaming, the sound of wood cracking, and always, that muffled sound of footsteps on wet carpet, even without rain. And that's why I decided to tell this story, not just to lift this weight off my shoulders, but because I know there are more people out there who have experienced something they can't explain. A place, an energy, a feeling of being watched. It leaves its mark, sometimes invisible but profound. If this kind of thing makes sense to you, comment below. I'm on this journey too, because the next part of this goes way beyond what I imagined. That early morning, the reception area was empty, as usual. The sound of the wall clock was the only constant noise, marking each second with almost unnerving precision. I was distracting myself with a lukewarm coffee, scanning the security monitor screen, when I heard the muffled sound of the glass doorbells opening. A man entered, and the moment he crossed the threshold, the air seemed to change density. He was different, too elegant for this place. Tall, with dark hair slicked back, and a beard trimmed with surgical precision. He wore an impeccably tailored grey suit, and his shoes weren't even dusty from the dirt parking lot outside. It was as if he'd stepped out of a place where time obeyed other rules. But what caught my attention most was his gaze. That gaze. There was something there that didn't belong here, neither aggressive nor gentle, just strange, as if he saw more than I could reveal. He approached the counter and said, in a low but firm voice, "Room 12." It was like being slapped in the face with a cold slap. I replied, immediately, almost reflexively, "That room is vacant, sir. I can offer you room 14 or room 6, both renovated." But he didn't even blink. He just repeated, slowly, as if reading an old password, "Room 12." The way he pronounced each syllable gave me chills. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a request. It was a decision made. One of those decisions that seems to come from someone who saw what comes next and doesn't care what the price. In an attempt to lighten the mood, I leaned over the counter and kept trying. "We've had incidents there. It's never been renovated. There's not even a key anymore." He then took something from his inside jacket pocket, and when he placed it on the counter, I felt my heart skip a beat. It was the old keychain. The same one, darkened metal, hand-engraved with the number 12, deeply scratched as if it had been carved with urgency. The same one I was sure was locked in the basement, along with other forgotten items from the motel. He said, "I don't need your permission, just your presence." At that moment, something inside me wavered, as if an ancient part of my mind, a part we learned to ignore over time, had been awakened. I tried to laugh. I tried to rationalize, but the hairs on my arms were already standing on end before I could even say anything. Without me releasing any keys, he walked to the end of the hallway, his steps heavy and deliberate. I watched through the cameras, and the lights went out behind him, one by one, as if sucked in by his passage. When he reached the door to room 12, he paused for a few seconds, and the door simply opened. There was no latch, no creak. It simply gave way, as if the room knew who was there. In the surveillance room, the cameras went black. All of them. The screen went black for almost a minute, and when it came back on, he was gone. The hallway was empty. I tried to run there, but my legs felt strangely heavy. And for some reason I still can't explain, I felt such ancient fear that my entire body refused to move. I stood at the reception door, breathing shallowly, waiting for some sound, some sign. Nothing, just silence. Over the next few days, the entire motel atmosphere seemed contaminated. Employees complained of nightmares. One quit. Another was found crying inside his car, saying he heard whispers coming from the walls. Even the coffee in the lobby began to taste strange, metallic. But no one said anything directly. They just looked at each other with that expression, You only see when everyone knows something is about to break, but no one wants to be the first to admit it. I also began to notice that some objects were disappearing and reappearing in the wrong places. The system's guest list would freeze every time I typed 12, and every now and then, in the middle of the night, the phone would ring, and on the other end, there would be only breathing. The strangest thing is that no one else saw that man leave. Not on the cameras, not in the parking lot. No cars started that night. No doors were opened, no keys were returned, just emptiness. And that's when I began to understand that this wasn't just an isolated event. It was part of something bigger, part of a plot hidden between the cracks of reality, as if there were points of contact between worlds, and that motel was one of them. Over time, I began to believe he hadn't arrived there by chance. It was a reactivation, a calculated return, as if someone, or something, had waited for the right moment to open a door that shouldn't have existed anymore. And the scariest thing of all is that it seems the door hasn't completely closed. Since then, I've been trying to piece together the evidence, understand the signs, follow the trail. But the more I investigate, the more I realize I'm moving away from what's safe, from what's rational, as if by touching these fragments, I'm slowly being pulled to the other side of this hidden truth. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." If at any point in your life you too felt that something was wrong in a place where everything seemed too normal. Because when the surface is too calm, it's a sign that something much deeper is about to emerge. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject. During one of my late-night shifts, with the silence crackling inside my skull and no movement, I decided to rummage through the motel's physical archives. There was a small room in the back, used more as a repository for old paperwork than anything else. Jammed drawers, musty-smelling folders, and typewriter-stamped dates. Inside, buried among maintenance records and supplier invoices from the 1980s, I found a brown envelope, yellowed at the edges, and with the words, "Restricted, do not discard," written in faded red. I remember the chills that ran down my spine when I read the content. The document was a police report, very old. The pages were glued together by time and humidity. It concerned a cold case that had occurred in room 12. And it all started with a guest who had checked in under a false name. He spent 3 nights there, 3 nights of absolute silence. No one saw him leave the room, no calls for service, no complaints. Until, on the 4th day, the screams began. The chambermaid at the time reported hearing loud noises in the early morning, as if furniture were being dragged. Then, silence. Late that morning, they found the naked man crouched in the corner of the room, staring at the wall and repeating the same phrase in a low voice. They whisper behind the paint. What was inside was inexplicable. The mirrors had been turned to face the wall. The light bulbs had been ripped out by hand, and the only writing, in what appeared to be blood mixed with rust, was a sentence on the back of the bed. It wasn't a dream, it was a visit. The police were called, of course, but what happened next was what intrigued me most. According to the report, the case was sealed as a severe psychotic episode. Without further investigation, the guest was hospitalized and never spoke again. The room was sealed by order of management for structural security reasons, according to the report at the time, a flimsy excuse to hide something much bigger. Because behind the scenes, the order was clear: don't open it, never again. And then it all fell by the wayside, or was pushed there on purpose. But the energy of a place like that doesn't disappear over time. It slumbers, it waits, and returns. After reading that document, my perception changed. I began to notice prints, marks that had been there all along, but I hadn't seen them. Like stains on the walls of the hallway leading to room 12, barely perceptible, circular marks, as if fingers had been dragged across the still damp plaster. or the strange smell that sometimes appeared out of nowhere, a mixture of iron and lavender, the same smell described in the 1980s bulletin. This began to consume me. I needed to understand what had really happened, and that's when I decided to reach out to a former employee mentioned in the report. It took me weeks to track down someone who worked there in the 1990s. Her name was Nadine. Today she lives in seclusion in a small town in Arizona. I got her phone number from a former manager who incidentally hung up the moment he heard the word Room 12. Nadine answered with a low, weak voice, as if she carried the years in her lungs. When I introduced myself and told her where I was from, she was silent for several seconds. Then she whispered, "Are you still open?" I explained that no, the room had been sealed, but she just laughed. A dry laugh, as if she already knew that kind of thing couldn't be sealed with boards and nails. She told me that back then, it was common to hear voices at night, especially when walking through empty hallways. That once, after cleaning room 14, she saw the door to room 12 ajar, even though it was sealed with an internal alarm. And that, out of curiosity, she tried to look through a small crack. She said she saw nothing and everything at the same time. It was like looking into your own mind, but in a different light, an unforgiving light. According to her, every employee who entered that room, even briefly, suffered some kind of emotional breakdown. One attempted to take his own life. Another dropped everything and became a pastor. A third simply disappeared, leaving his wallet, clothes and car in the parking lot and never reappeared. That's why the then management decided to bury everything. Burn records, change the database structure, pretend the room never existed, as if erasing his name would also erase his presence. But that doesn't work when the place itself refuses to be forgotten. Ever since that man in the grey suit last visited, I'd begun to dream about what Nadine described. Not exactly images, but sensations, as if I were floating inside a ceilingless space, with pulsating walls that breathed with me. And always, at the center of it all, there was a door. The same door, cracked, its paint peeling, the number 12 carved behind the paint. It called to me. It always called to me. The hidden truth I've been discovering is that certain doors aren't meant to be opened with bare hands. They open with decisions, with intentions, with energy. And when someone insists on crossing that kind of threshold, something crosses back. Comment below. I'm on this journey too. If you've ever felt like something around you was trying to tell you more than it seemed, because once we start listening, certain voices never shut up. The reopening of room 12 wasn't authorized by any superior. There was no memo, no official request, no warning of any kind. It simply happened, as if the motel itself had accepted that it was time to open what had been buried. And I wasn't the only one who felt this way. That night, one of the oldest employees, Clive, a man who rarely spoke and always had a glazed look in his eyes, showed up early, wearing thick gloves, a cloth mask and a toolbox in his hands. When I asked what he was doing there, he simply replied, "Someone's going to have to do it right." We walked up together. With each step down that hallway, the floor creaked louder than usual, as if in protest. The lights, which had been on hours before, flickered in a rhythm that seemed to respond to our movements. When we stopped in front of the door, the air was thick, not cold, but dense, as if we were about to cross a portal into something illogical. The boards were removed one by one. The sound of the hammer striking the nails echoed like muffled thunder, creating a kind of ritualistic rhythm. The yellow tape marked "Do Not Enter" was worn, almost transparent with age. Clive ripped it open with his hands without hesitation, and as the last board fell to the floor, the smell escaped. It was more than mold, more than something old. It was a thick, metallic smell that seemed to seep through the skin. I immediately tasted rust in my mouth. Clive, despite his mask, gasped, and for a brief moment the sound of the hallway was replaced by something I swear I heard, a whisper, low, ragged, coming from inside the wall. The doorknob was cold as ice, but not locked. As I turned it, I noticed the door offered no resistance, as if it had never truly been locked, as if it had been waiting for this very moment to open. The room was as old accounts described it. The wallpaper was stained, peeling in wide strips like dead skin. The carpet, soaked in places, had a dark, almost black hue, as if hiding layers and layers of something that never dried. The bed, oddly made, had starched, perfectly straight sheets, but with a small dip in the center, as if someone were still lying there. And then we saw the clock. On the wall opposite the bed, an antique analog clock with a corroded gold frame read exactly 3:11. The second hand didn't move, and there was no sign of working batteries. But the strange thing was, no matter how many times I looked at it afterward, it always showed the same time, 3:11. That image was etched in my mind like a brand, because that very morning at exactly 3:11, I woke up at home with a high-pitched noise in my ears and my body paralyzed. Unable to move, I felt as if something were watching me from the doorway of my bedroom. I saw nothing, but I knew I had brought something with me. Returning to the night of the reopening, Clive walked to the center of the room, looked around calmly as if searching for something specific. He stopped in front of the bathroom mirror, cracked in a diagonal line, and said, "It's still here." I asked what. He didn't answer. He just rested his hand against the glass and closed his eyes, breathing deeply, as if trying to remember something he didn't want to be remembered. It was then that the light in the room blinked, once, twice, 3 times, and stopped. Clive emerged from the bathroom, pale, breathing heavily. He said there was writing on the mirror, but I wasn't supposed to see it, that if I did, I wouldn't be able to unsee it. He asked us to lock the room again, but it was too late, because at that moment, the door slammed shut on its own, not violently, but firmly, and the lock turned, locked inside. We froze. We tried to open it, push it, turn the handle. Nothing worked. From inside, a sound began to emerge, like wood being scratched, slow, steady, coming from all sides at once. There were no screams, no moans, no voices, only the sound of presence, dense, ancient, waiting. When the door finally opened of its own accord, the room was empty. The mirror was clean, the bed was untouched, but the clock still read 3:11. That night, Clive left without a word. The next day, he didn't show up for his shift. He also didn't answer calls. I later learned that he'd dropped everything and gone to live in a remote cabin with no phone or internet. According to an acquaintance, he said he needed to stay where time doesn't count the hours. Since then, I've lived a kind of double shift. During the day, I was the same tired receptionist, dealing with guests, reservations, and everyday problems. But at night, every detail of room 12 revealed itself to me in subtle ways. Sounds only I could hear, cameras that crashed at 3:11, dreams that ended in the same hallway. I began to understand that reopening that room wasn't an ordinary mistake. It was a decision that touched something deeper, as if by tearing that yellow tape we had broken an invisible contract, a pact between the world we see and what lies beyond it. Comment below. That makes sense to me. If you've ever felt something open, even when no one else can see it, because some doors don't need locks to be dangerous. They just need witnesses. The first night after reopening was the longest of my life. No one mentioned room 12 out loud, but the mood among the staff had completely changed. Even the most skeptical, the ones who scoffed at the stories, began avoiding the second floor after dusk. The motel's daily routine seemed the same. Guests arriving late, people leaving early, the phone ringing intermittently. But there was something beneath the surface, a veiled discomfort, an awkward silence in the hallways. No one wanted to admit it, but everyone felt it. During the late-night shift, I stood in reception, trying not to constantly stare at the CCTV screens. But it was inevitable. The monitor seemed to draw me in with a strange force, as if to say, "You have to see it." And I did. At 3:04 a.m., the camera in the east hallway, the one with room 12, began to display interference. First, a faint hiss, as if some sort of magnetic field were disturbing the image, then a flickering of the colors, and then, what seemed impossible, the door to room 12 flickered. Not the outside light, not the hallway lamp, the door itself. It emitted a subtle glow, as if reflecting a non-existent light source. I fast-forwarded the recording in slow motion, and there it was, a human silhouette, blurry, distorted, standing right in front of the door for less than 2 seconds, and then it disappeared. It didn't walk, it didn't move, it didn't turn its back. It simply vanished from the frame, as if it had been switched off. That couldn't be a reflection. There was no one there. The entire floor was empty. I'd checked every room myself beforehand. No sign of movement, no guests staying in that wing, no reason for anyone or anything to be standing still at that exact time. The reception light flickered, not the one on the ceiling, the one on the lamp, which sat on the counter and had never failed. I stood up, a shiver running down every vertebrae of my spine. The air felt colder, thicker, and for a moment I swear I heard the creak of the wooden floor upstairs. Footsteps, slow, one at a time, undergone. The hallway was dark. The night lights, which automatically turned on with movement, didn't activate. I walked with my heart pounding as if each step echoed inside my chest. I stopped in front of door 12. It was closed, locked, but the camera's motion sensor light was on, indicating that something or someone was nearby. I decided to go back. When I went downstairs, the reception area was silent, as if nothing had happened. But on the monitor, room 12 now had the light on, and that chilled me to the core. Because at that moment, I remembered an important detail. The light bulb in that room had been removed weeks before, when the motel was still trying to seal off any trace of that wing. There was no light installed in the ceiling, there was no working switch, and yet it was lit. This began to repeat itself over the following nights, always around 3 a.m., always with that anomalous glow. The silhouette appeared and disappeared. Sometimes standing still, sometimes walking down the hallway. Other times, it appeared closer to the camera, distorted, as if observing, as if it knew I was there on the other side watching. One of the cleaning staff, Hector, also witnessed the strange behavior of the lights. He told me that while vacuuming the second floor one afternoon, the light in room 12 blinked on its own 3 times, and the digital clock on his phone froze at exactly 3:11 p.m., the same time reversed as the room clock. Coincidence? Perhaps. But when you live surrounded by so many fragments of something that defies logic, you learn to respect patterns like this. I began recording the times, noting the details. I recorded clips from the cameras, made notes on the electrical behavior of the lights. But the more I observed, the more distant I felt from reality. It was as if the very act of paying attention brought things closer. What had once seemed strange began to feel intimate, familiar, like a cycle slowly closing, and you're trapped inside it. It was then that I realized it wasn't just about the room, but what it represented, a rupture point, a kind of open, wound between dimensions, a literal and symbolic door to something that may have always existed, but that only reveals itself to those who choose to look. This revelation began to change my mindset. I realized that the greatest danger wasn't what you saw, but what you felt. The micro-sensations, the change in temperature, the sounds that only occur when the world is silent, that feeling that you're no longer alone, even when everything around you says otherwise. It was then that I began to understand. The journey was no longer about discovering what had happened in the past. It was about what was being activated in the present. The second night began peacefully, too peaceful even. The kind of silence that's disturbing not because of the missing sounds, but because of the lack of movement. The landline didn't ring. No new guests appeared. The street in front of the motel was empty, as if time had slowed down only on that stretch of road. It was like being inside a suspended scene, one of those moments you feel but can't explain. I tried to keep my mind occupied with old reports, irrelevant paperwork, anything that would distract me from the monitor, where room 12 remained as always, with the light on. And it was exactly at 2:48 in the morning that the first interference happened. The intercom on the reception wall, that old analog model that only connected rooms to the front desk through an internal system, began to squeak, a high-pitched noise, similar to the sound of a damaged cassette tape. But the detail that stopped me cold was this, that intercom had been disconnected, cut off, months ago, ever since the main cables had corroded due to water infiltration and the manager decided not to fix it. "Even so," he hissed. I stood up slowly, already feeling that weight in my chest that only appears when reason begins to lose ground to perception. I approached. The noise ceased for a second, and then came the voice. Low, almost inaudible, as if from behind a very thick wall, but it was clear enough to send a shiver down my spine. "You opened, nothing more, that's all." And then silence again. I tried to answer. I picked up the phone even though I had no connection and said, "Who's there?" But the line remained dead. No sound, no breathing, nothing. When I looked back at the monitor, room 12 remained the same. The lights were on, the door closed, no movement in the hallway. But then I noticed a new detail, the bedroom television, which should have been off, since empty rooms are automatically de-energized to save energy, was on. It showed no channels, no images, just a screen full of static. But in the background, there was something else. I turned up the volume on the surveillance system, and I swear, with everything I have, I heard voices amidst the hiss, not conversations, not direct words. They were whispers, several, overlapping, as if different people were trying to speak at the same time, but without direction, without a single addressee, just trying to exist within that distorted sound. And between the broken sentences, one fragment repeated itself with disturbing clarity. "He's still there." The feeling of being watched intensified. It was as if something unseen by the cameras was stalking the entire motel. My eyes began to sting and a slight pressure settled over my chest. I went to the window to breathe, to get away, to regain my sense of reality. Outside, the parking lot remained empty, but what really paralyzed me was seeing the door to room 12 slightly open, not wide open, just wide enough to leave a dark gap between the wood and the doorframe. That gap we avoid facing for fear of meeting eyes on the other side. I ran back to the monitor, trying to confirm this wasn't a trick of my mind. But on camera, the door remained closed, completely closed. And for the first time, I realized that time inside the room seemed to operate on a different frequency. Because while the rest of the cameras displayed the real time, 3:03, the one in room 12 had frozen at 3:11. Again, as if trapped, as if that space no longer obeyed the rules of the clock. I decided to do something I'd avoided until then, open the guest register for the night the man had arrived. But there were no names, no entries. The digital system showed that room 12 was vacant. Interestingly, by protocol, any room opening generates an automatic internal code. But there was nothing. No key history, no transactions, no magnetic card access. It was as if he had never stayed, and yet he was there. I went down to the electrical panel to check the circuit breakers. The switch in room 12 was marked off, yet everything remained on. The lights, the TV, the heating system. I even manually turned the circuit off and on again, but nothing changed. As if that space had already disconnected from the building's common structure and operated on its own energy. Something denser, more primal, as if the presence that inhabited it no longer needed our electricity, but our attention. On my way back to reception, I noticed something even stranger. The television static now followed a pattern. It pulsed, alternating between lighter and darker tones, almost like breathing. And subtly, I became aware that the whispers were becoming more distinct. Single words began to emerge from the confusion. Stay, listen, follow. They were commands, weak, still, but direct and deeply disturbing. I grabbed a pen and paper and began jotting down the words I could make out. As I wrote, my handwriting changed. The letters trembled, the strokes became longer, as if my hand were being guided, as if, by recording those sentences, I was building a firmer bridge between myself and that. The last word I wrote that morning was inside. On the third night, something broke, for good. The tenuous barrier between maybe and undeniable was shattered, and I felt it before I even realized what exactly was happening. It was something internal, a kind of dark intuition that presses against your chest and warns, without words, you've passed the point of no return. It all started with a power outage, or at least that's what it seemed. At 2:55 a.m., the lights in the main hallway began to flicker. First in slow sequence, then in rhythmic bursts, as if some kind of intelligence were behind the flickering. On the security monitor, the circuitry on the upper floor began to grain. The images became distorted, almost liquid. Flickering lines slithered across the screen like electrical tentacles. And then, for the first time since all this began, I made a spur-of-the-moment decision. I went upstairs. My footsteps echoed loudly. Each step of the wooden staircase sounded louder than the last, as if the entire building were listening to me ascend. When I reached the second floor, the overhead light still flickered, but I could see the hallway. It was empty except for that invisible presence that had become almost constant. The air was heavy, as if every molecule had gained density, and then I heard it. Not a noise, not an ordinary noise, but a muffled laugh. Low, laden with something ancient, hoarse and impure. The sound came from behind the door of room 12. It didn't seem human. It didn't even seem to be trying to be. It was something that mimicked the idea of laughter, but without understanding what it meant, as if it were merely echoing human emotions. It paralyzed me. For a few seconds, my body froze in place, as if it had been plunged into concrete. I felt my stomach churn, a metallic taste rising in my throat, and then suddenly all the lights in the hallway went out. All of them, at the same time. There was no gradual failure, there was no snap, just total darkness. The only thing that remained was the sound of my rapid breathing, and then came the scream, dry, short, sharp. It didn't seem to come from a human being. And the most terrifying thing was realizing that it didn't echo throughout the building. It vibrated inside me, as if it had been shouted straight to my bones. I felt the impact in my sternum, in my teeth, in my marrow. A scream that didn't call for help, nor betray pain. It was a scream of existence, of something that wanted to be recognized. Instinctively, I ran. The stairs seemed endless. Each flight seemed to pull me back, as if the building wanted to keep me there. When I finally reached the reception area, my vision was blurry, my hands shaking. But the lights were on, as if nothing had happened. I went straight to the monitor. The system had crashed at 3:11. The frozen frame showed the hallway, just as the lights went out. No visible presence, no figure. But one detail made me shiver. On the floor, right in front of the door to room 12, there was something, a scratch, as if something had been dragged, a black, jagged line with finger or claw marks along the edges, a pattern that hadn't been there the previous days. I paused. I rewound. I went frame by frame, and the scratch simply appeared, suddenly, without origin, without explanation. Since that night, I have never been able to stay upstairs alone again. Small things started happening. The television in the reception area would turn on by itself in the wee hours of the morning, always with static channels, always at 3:11 a.m. The phone would ring with a non-existent number, 00000000, and when I answered, I'd hear only labored breathing, sometimes two breaths at once, one closer, the other more. Deep. No one else approached room 12. Not guests, not staff. It was as if it had been officially forgotten again, as if the internal rules, even if unspoken, had come into effect again. A pact of silence was re-established. But the room did not accept this silence. One morning, as I was passing by reception to get a cup of coffee, I noticed that the room number for room 12 had reappeared in the system. It was blank. No name, no ID number. Just one field filled in. Stay 3 nights. 3 nights. The same amount of time the first guest spent there decades ago. The same time frame described in the police report. The same duration that seems to trigger something in that room. I deleted the entry. I rebooted the system, but it kept coming back, always, and each time it appeared the date was updated to the next morning, as if something were programming itself to continue, to remain. I started losing sleep, my appetite, my clarity. I dreamed of doors opening on their own, of endless hallways, of mirrors reflecting expressions that weren't mine. I dreamed of the voice that said, "You opened it, but now..." It added something more. "Now it's up to you." Dawn arrived that day like a farce. Sunlight hit the motel's facade, tinting the building with that orange hue that usually brings relief. But something was wrong. The day was too bright, too silent, as if the environment itself were trying to mask what had happened in the dark hours. It was as if everything around me was staging an artificial normality. And I, who hadn't slept a wink, felt every second of that new day scratch at my mind. The first thing I noticed was the security monitor stuck on a static image of the second-floor hallway. The digital hand was frozen at 3:11. Again, I churned, gasping for breath. I tried to reboot the system. Nothing. All the cameras were working, except that one, as if the hallway itself had become disconnected from time since last night. As if it were operating under a parallel logic. I walked up slowly. The hallway was empty, seemingly calm, but there was a sense of absence there, a kind of echo that didn't come from sound, but from absence, as if something had occupied that space and departed, taking with it everything natural. I stopped in front of the door to room 12. It was closed, locked from the inside. I turned the handle. I pushed. I knocked. No answer. But the same density hung in the air, like a presence imbued in the wood, the door frames, the cracks. I called another employee. We tried opening it with the master keys. Nothing. No conventional tools worked. As if the door wasn't just closed, but sealed by a will that wasn't human. It wasn't until one of the security guards used brute force, prying the hinge with a rusty crowbar, that the door finally gave way. And what we found on the other side was worse than anything we'd expected. The room was empty, completely empty. No sign of belongings, no bags, no clothes, no trace that anyone had even been there. The bed was untouched. The sheets were taut as if no one had touched them. The television was off. The clock stopped. Still 3:11. The guest had disappeared, but the worst was yet to come. It was only when we looked more closely at the walls that we noticed. In the left corner near the mirror, now cracked in a new direction, as if something had collided with it from the inside, there was writing. The letters were shaky, irregular, the strokes too long for ordinary. Human hands. They were painted with dark, almost black paint, but as we got closer we realized it was thicker, darker, more organic. The smell left no doubt. It was dried blood. The phrase was there, like a signature for something that didn't need a name. Now he is part. Just that. Nothing else was said, nothing else was left. But that sentence echoed as if it had been whispered in the ear of everyone who read it. One of the employees who had entered with me ran away and never returned. Another began to cry silently, staring at the floor, as if he had just recognized something there. Something he had known before he even saw it. And me? I stood still, feeling that that sentence was more than a warning. It was a confirmation, because deep down, I knew that Guest hadn't just disappeared. He'd been absorbed, transformed, become part of something bigger, something that lived in that space, something that waited for him, and perhaps continues to wait for more. It was the first time I realized that this kind of phenomenon isn't just about haunting or urban legend. It's about connection, about bonds, about cycles that repeat themselves because they carry a kind of hidden truth that no one wants to accept. Some places don't just exist in the physical world, they also live in the collective memory, in the unconscious, and they're always looking for someone to feed them. From that day on, everything in the motel began to change. Room 12 was locked again, this time with welding. The cameras in that wing were officially turned off. No one in the room wanted to clean the hallway anymore. Even guests began avoiding that side of the building without knowing exactly why. And strangely, the frequency of reservations increased, as if the place itself began to become a point of attraction for people carrying within themselves a specific kind of emptiness, as if it were a magnet for those who, even without knowing it, are also part of it. To the eyes of passers-by, room 12 is once again just a locked door, nothing more. A number erased from the system, a hidden space on internal maps, a shadow among so many abandoned rooms in roadside motels. But for those who lived through it, for those who were too close, it's impossible to pretend it doesn't exist. After the disappearance, I tried to carry on with life as normal. I threw myself into routine tasks, into reception spreadsheets, into night shifts, numbed by cheap coffee and heavy silence. But there was something that prevented me from switching off, something in the system. The guest's name never appeared, no personal information, no check-in record, but the room's status, even after it was sealed, even after it was removed from the dashboard, continued to alternate between occupied and cleaning, as if somewhere within the system, a presence remained there, active, operating, as if the network itself had absorbed it as a routine, a cycle it could no longer escape. At first, I thought it was a technical glitch. I tried restarting the panel. Nothing. I asked the technician to review the automation center. He looked at the lines of code one by one and said something that gave me chills. This room shouldn't even be here. There's no linked script. There's no associated structure. It's like a shadow within the system. After that, the cameras in that hallway started to fail permanently. It wasn't just normal interference. It wasn't a faulty cable. They disappeared. They disappeared from the internal map, the security settings, the history. They disappeared as if they'd never existed. And then the manager did what every place does when it's about to collapse from the inside out. He went silent. He called the top staff together for a short, dry meeting on a late afternoon when the sun seemed redder than usual. He said the matter of room 12 was closed. Anyone who continues to feed rumors will be dismissed. With those words, he didn't deny. He didn't explain. He simply forbade. From that moment on, what had been a veiled tension turned into a noisy absence. No one spoke. No one looked. Everyone avoided passing near the East Wing. Even the new employees who were unaware of the story began to act with the same fear, as if the fear were contagious, as if the hidden truth were being passed on wordlessly through gestures, through looks, through silence. It was around this time that I started to feel something different, something inside me. At first, they were lapses. Short moments when I'd catch myself staring at the computer screen, unsure of how long I'd been there. Then came the recurring dreams, always with the same scenario. Me walking down a hallway that seemed to stretch on forever, lined with identical doors. In the background, a humming sound, like a broken fan. And always, at the end of that hallway, there was a single door slightly ajar. And no matter how much I fought it, my feet always carried me to it. I began to experience constant feelings of déjà vu, small things. A guest I was certain I'd met before, even though I knew it was the first time. A song playing softly in the reception area that seemed to echo within me, as if I already knew every note. A specific smell in the air, of stored clothes, of damp rust, of old paint, that triggered memories that weren't mine. Sometimes I dreamed of the face of the man who had disappeared, but not the way I saw him in person. It was as if I saw him in another life, in other on contexts, always in borderline situations, always in front of doors, always being called. I began to wonder if he was the first, or if he was just the latest in a long chain that no one noticed. Because the deeper I delved into this enigma, the more I felt like it hadn't all started with him, nor with the old outbreak decades ago, nor with the stories whispered in the hallways. It felt like something older, something that existed before the building, before the walls, before the road was even paved. And that's when everything starts to take on a different meaning. Perhaps room 12 isn't just a physical space. Perhaps it's a point of convergence, a kind of torn veil where memories, intentions, and pain intertwine. A space where time loses its sequence and reality folds in on itself. A portal that doesn't open with a key, but with presence, with attention, with surrender. And the most disturbing thing was realizing that little by little, I was becoming part of it too. My nights began to feel shorter, not because I slept less, but because I woke up feeling as if I'd been somewhere else. A dark, roofless place with breathing walls, and always, the number 12 stamped somewhere, on a wall, on the floor, on the roof of someone's mouth whispering my name. I stopped trusting the time, the calendars. Sometimes I lost track of what was dreaming and what was waking. I started writing down everything I remembered in a notebook, but even that started to blur together. A day. I found a note written in my own handwriting, but I didn't remember writing it. It said, "You've been here before." And that's when I first asked myself, what if I had never left? Since that night, the room was reopened, or perhaps awakened is the more accurate word. My perception of reality has not returned to what it was before. And I say this with the certainty of someone who has felt, little by little, the logic of everyday life dissolve. Everything that seemed fixed to me, schedule, routine, even people's voices, began to take on an echoey tone, as if a second layer of meaning were always lurking beneath the surface. I continued working at the motel for a while longer, even after the disappearances, the warnings, the silent orders to keep quiet about it. Part of me couldn't leave. Something kept me trapped, not out of fear, but out of an irrational need to understand, to try to name what lurks behind that door with a number that insists on returning, like a cycle that refuses to be broken. And then one night, it happened again. The reception bell rang, 3 hours and 11 minutes in the morning. Alone, no one in the parking lot, no reservations planned, just the dry, metallic sound cutting through the early morning silence as a reminder that some doors don't close just because we turn our backs. I walked to the entrance, lights off, no silhouettes outside. I glanced at the monitor, the second-floor hallway, the one that had been removed from the system, now displayed a frozen image. The same as always, the door to room 12 closed, with the shadow of something cast on the floor. But this time, there was a new detail, a small dark spot just below the doorknob, as if someone had left their hand there for too long. I walked back to the reception area in silence. I sat down, and for some reason I couldn't quite understand, I grabbed a piece of paper and wrote, "Would you dare come in again?" The sentence startled me, not because of its content, but because it appeared there, written in my own handwriting, before I realized I was writing, as if the question were already written, just waiting for me to write it down. That's when I understood. Room 12 isn't just a physical place. It's a decision, an access point, an invitation that renews itself every time curiosity overcomes self-preservation. It doesn't force anyone, it just waits. And this waiting shapes everything around it, silently. To this day, no one has found the original key. That key carved with a fingernail, with the number crooked, the metal darkened by time. Some say it never existed. Others believe it disappeared with the first guest who became part of it. Personally, I think the key was never meant to be found, because what opens that door isn't in your pocket, it's in your mind, in the place where we keep what we can't explain, but also can't forget. Sometimes the reception phone rings once and then stops. Other times the system beeps, letting us know that room 12 has been accessed. But when we check, everything is the same, locked, silent, almost innocent, as if mocking its own past. And yet, every night at 3:11 I wake up, even if I don't want to, even if I don't look at the clock. I know, something pulls me back. Maybe it's just a cycle my mind created. Maybe I'm trapped in an experience that surpassed the limits of reality and now lives in the space between senses and memories. Or maybe, much more simply and disturbingly, room 12 never truly let me go, because certain places, when they choose us, they don't unchoose us later. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story spoke to you. Maybe it was doubt, a thrill, or just that silent feeling that something exists between what we see and what we feel. I just want to thank you for sticking with me through this journey. If this kind of content resonates with you, if these stories make you think differently, if they connect you with something deeper, subscribe to the channel. That way we can continue exploring these invisible layers of what they call reality together. And comment below, I'm with you until the end, just so I know you were with me until the very last second. These messages are what motivate me the most to continue bringing stories like this. Oh, and if at any point this video captivated you, made you imagine, made you feel, leave a like. It shows that this connection was worth it.